Welcome back to Bonchon Warrior, where we live wonderfully and bring our best. This is Ian Schneider, your host, and today, let's resume our previously interrupted programming. I remember when I first went to orientation, and there was a speaker that came. He was a Canadian guy named Phil, and he gave me one of the most important pieces of advice that I took with me when I went to my school, which was, you are not as important to your school as you think you are.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were pissed off. But I listened to that, and at first I was just like, well, that sucks. And the second thing I thought was, oh, that's great. Now I can sort of walk in with an open mind, and I can try to do what my school needs me to do, rather than trying to come in and tell them how things ought to be done.
Yeah. And I think I really don't like grammar translation teaching, and Korea needs to move away from grammar translation teaching. But there are all kinds of reasons why CELTA communicative language teaching, almost kind of cookie cutter style of communicative language teaching, I mean, if that just worked really well in Korean classrooms, it would have taken off much more easily, and it hasn't, because there are all kinds of issues with it. And I think even just things like the sense of the way you have a dialogue is really culturally diverse. And for example, my students are often much more comfortable with big group stuff, which I really didn't like at first, because then everyone's speaking time is reduced. But there are reasons why they like big group stuff, and often that's kind of more flexible, and they can be more playful about how they use language. And it's letting them connect, like, so they have a kind of homeroom culture, and doing playful big group stuff is letting them connect using English to their homeroom culture, rather than saying, like, let's do a role play where you're a businessman in America or something. And so being more open-minded about that and learning about it, I think, has been really useful. And I think this connects to, I think our students need English as a global language, not as a native speaker language.
Can you explain a little bit what the difference is?
So I think we often teach as though we're teaching ESL, like students are going to go live in America or England or something. And that might be the case for one or two students. But for most of our students, they're going to be using English with people from other non-English speaking countries, like China or India or Indonesia.
Sure. I was at the Incheon airport one time, and a Vietnamese woman walked up to a Chinese man, and they conversed in English together, because that was the most shared linguistic strategy that they had between each other.
I have a Korean friend, who majored in Japanese, and he wanted to be a Korean to Japanese translator. And he worked for a company in Seoul that had an office in Tokyo as their translator. But his challenge was, when they all met together, it was easier just to speak English, because they all had decent English, and that was easier than like going through a translator. So he was like, oh no, I'm not needed. So there was still like document translation to do, and they made apps that had language in them, so translation is still going to be necessary, but there are a lot of situations where English is the lingua franca, and people aren't going to follow native speaker norms. So that goes back to, like, if you really insistently teach students a way of doing a kind of, I don't know, like a business meeting style dialogue that is very limited to the way native speakers would do it, that's not necessarily going to be helpful. But getting them to use language in flexible and spontaneous ways that maybe don't map perfectly onto a specific thing, but help them like grow their interlanguage, I think that's really useful. Because the thing about English as a global language is it's kind of hard to predict exactly what, like the meeting someone at Incheon airport, like you can't predict every little scenario that they're going to need English for.
Sure.
But doing things that help them develop their interlanguage and push their level, that work with Korean school culture, I think that's useful. I don't want to totally dislike everything I learned in my CELTA or something. More standard communicative tasks can work too. I just think don't like be totally stuck on doing those and think.
Yeah, I mean, I actually appreciate that you mentioned this. I think it's important that when we try to employ methodologies and consider what kind of methods or activities used in our classes, we should consider not only the mechanics of the language learning is involved, but also the cultural assumptions that might be underlying that language learning methodology.
Yeah. And yeah, so those were my 3 things. And my last
Just
thing,
to recap, classroom management.
Yes.
Burst through the bubble to be able to integrate yourself and to work within your school system and to understand your students. And number 3 was
humility.
Humility.
Approach the whole thing with humility. Yeah, I like that you're not that important to your school. I also think like the whole it's not rocket science thing in Learning Teaching by Jim Scrivener. I think in the introduction he says like it's very unlikely anyone's going to die from your teaching or anything. Like it's not you're not a doctor, you're not a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
So yeah, have some humility about the whole enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think reflection is so important, because I'll make tons of mistakes, but as long as I can, try to improve and try to gradually sort of sharpen my teaching, it's never perfect, but you can always try to do better.
And you mentioned reflection. So my last little tip is that I think it's really helpful to take control of your own professional development. And of course, I mention this because I'm chapter president for Gwangju Jeonnam Kodesol.
Oh, really?
And we have monthly chapter meetings, or at least once the coronavirus situation blows over, we will be returning to monthly chapter meetings in Gwangju.
Yeah. And
I really encourage people to come to those. We're very friendly, and it's totally free for newcomers to come and try us out. We have every month we have a couple of workshops focused on all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And so I think people should come to that. But in general, with professional development, I think it's like I mentioned with other things, it's like trying a bunch of different things and finding what works. Because if you get into this thinking of like, well, my school should provide me with the perfect workshop. Well, like there's no perfect workshop. You have to make a bunch of different connections, and one workshop isn't going to teach you everything. But if you go to like 10 or 15 workshops, you're going to find something that's really helpful to you and get professional development happening. But there are different things to do, like you can do reflective practice personally, like keep a teaching journal or something. I think try a bunch of different things and take control of your own development. That's really helpful. But come to our chapter meetings.
Yes, I will see you there. I hope others will see you there as well.
I hope you're presenting for us sometime soon.
I know, I'm very excited. I'm going to be giving a talk on charisma for some reason. So I'm really excited about that. And I've been really happy to speak with you today, Bryan.
Great to speak to you. Thank you for interviewing me. I feel honored to appear in your blog, in your podcast.
It's my pleasure. I've never interviewed a president before. So thank you for joining us on Banchan Warrior. This is Ian, reminding you to live wonderfully and always bring your best.